We have all these apps on our phones that have all kinds of information about us. And so when we think about that data tracking in the private sector, we're thinking like, yeah, I need to use my Google Maps. I want to know where the closest Chipotle is to me at all times. What we know is that they collect that information and then they sell it to other places to target us with ads. And it's super annoying, but who cares, right? Well, it turns out that the government is buying that same data from Facebook, Google, Pizza Hut, whatever brokers they sell the information to, and the credit reporting agencies. All of these companies that make billions of dollars collecting our information and selling it to anyone willing to pay. Well, it turns out the government is willing to pay. And we don't know exactly what they're doing with it. Think of the possibilities. For example, Vice recently reported on their Motherboard blog that Muslim Pro, which is an app for Muslim prayers, Muslim Pro sold its data to a broker who then sold it to the defense contractors that work with the military. And you might not be a Muslim, but do you think the government might have some interest in purchasing the data from, for instance, maybe some of the Jesus-y apps, now that the MAGA folks are considered domestic terrorists? We could all get caught up in this.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 241st episode of Congressional Dish. I'm yours, Jennifer Briney. And if this is your first time listening to Congressional Dish, hello, welcome. This is a podcast that I started a long time ago now. I think it was in 2012, because I was reading bills and laws and watching hearings because I'm a nerd and I wanted to know what Congress was doing with my money and in my name. And so I was paying attention, and it turns out they were doing a lot of things with my money and in my name that I did not know about and didn't feel like we were being adequately informed about. And having this information in my head and having no one to talk to about it was making me insane. And so I started this podcast to see maybe other people give a shit too. And it turns out plenty of people do. And so 9 years later, this is my full-time job. This podcast is fully independent. It is supported by producers like you who also feel like this information should be out there, that someone should be actually reading the bills and the laws and telling us what's in them and following up and stuff. And so that's what I'm doing here. And so for this episode today, I feel like it's really important for us to acknowledge and examine the Patriot Act, because on October 26th, so a couple days after this episode is released, we are going to celebrate the 20th anniversary of that law that was quickly passed in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. And one of the reasons that I wanted to do this is I feel like one of the most useful exercises I've done as the host of Congressional Dish is way back in, 2013, 2014. It was a long time ago, but I decided to read the entire Affordable Care Act, despite the fact that it had been law for a few years, because it just kept coming up. And at the time, the Republicans were trying to repeal and replace it, but they were also trying to screw with it in piecemeal. And so I felt like I would do my job better if I really understood the law so that I could really understand the changes being made. And lately, the Patriot Act just keeps coming up. And so I just felt like this would be a good exercise to do, to really understand the Patriot Act and to share what I found. And it actually was a really good exercise. And so I think you're going to enjoy this episode, because I definitely had some misconceptions about it that I think are cleared up. Because one of the reasons that I really wanted to look into this now is I wanted to see what the current status is of a lot of the Patriot Act provisions, because there have been these reauthorizations every few years. And the last one was during COVID, and I didn't actually know what happened to that. But we kept seeing these reauthorizations, and the way that it's discussed is people would say, the Patriot Act is expiring. The Patriot Act is expiring. But the truth is that is not the case. There was just a small piece of the Patriot Act that was expiring. The vast majority of the Patriot Act was permanent from the very beginning, and we've never looked at it again. So I actually think it was very useful for me to see what actually became law and what still remains law. So we'll talk about that in this episode. And then we also had the Patriot Act pop up recently when I did the episode titled The Safe Haven of Sanctions Evaders, because I had watched a hearing and they were talking about our sanctions, which are economic war measures, and how people get around them. It turns out, spoiler alert if you haven't heard it yet, but the safe haven of sanctions evaders is actually the United States. And a lot of those provisions that I was learning about while producing that episode were Patriot Act provisions. And so for this episode, I finally read them all. And then, of course, in 2013, I believe it was, a NSA contractor who was working for Booz Allen Hamilton named Edward Snowden. I'm sure you've heard of him. But he leaked so many documents proving that Patriot Act provisions and others, but a lot of these were Patriot Act provisions that were being used by the government, both the George W. Bush administration and Obama administration, to basically spy on all the digital content, not necessarily the content, but all the digital data in the world. And that was insane. And in the wake of that, some of the Patriot Act provisions were changed by the USA Freedom Act in 2015. Now, I did an episode on that and I recently re-listened to it. That episode's really good and it's worth your time. And I've put that episode in the show notes for you. So if you want to understand the changes that were made in 2015, that's a good way to do it. But I wanted to read the original thing to make sure that I've seen all of the provisions, especially the ones that were permanent right from the beginning and weren't touched by USA Freedom. And it turns out there were a lot of them. And that's important because the fact that they never had to be reauthorized, that meant that we never looked at them again. And they're still in law and they're still affecting people to this day. And I also wanted to understand the process because we have seen new laws created in such scandalous ways over the last 9 years of this podcast. I mean, how many times have we seen bills that are thousands of pages long passed with just a few hours allowed for our representatives to read them? And we keep seeing committee processes skipped over and over again. We're seeing that right now with this whole reconciliation bill process where this bill, which is very important to the ruling party, the Democratic Party, is being changed, but it's being done behind closed doors. So we don't really know what the changes are. They're doing negotiations, but this isn't being done in committee. And that seems to be getting worse. And so I wanted to know what the process was for the Patriot Act. Like how closely was this bill examined? Were the problems with it known at the time? And therefore, are we justified in holding yes votes against people who are still serving in Congress? And that's the other thing, too. I will tell you today how many people voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago and are still in this Congress. The numbers were shocking to me. And so that's what this episode is. I'm going to tell you all of that. So sit back and enjoy. Okay, so let's get started with this by looking at the Patriot Act itself. Because one of the misconceptions that I think I've kind of already touched on is that there have been times that we've been told that the Patriot Act is expiring, and that is not true. From the very beginning, only about 10% of the provisions in the Patriot Act even had a sunset, which means they even had an expiration date, which means that 90% of the Patriot Act was permanent law right from the beginning. And a lot of that has remained law and has remained untouched in the last 20 years. And so one of the first questions that I had was, sometimes in situations, we know that there are times when our members of Congress have no time to read a bill. And so in those instances, it can kind of be forgiven if they missed something in their quick scan. So like, for instance, I did an episode recently about Belarus because I found some provisions related to economic war against Belarus and Russia. That was the big story in that episode. But we're expanding our economic war against Belarus in a regime change attempt. And that was authorized in I think it was the defense authorization or the funding bill. I can't remember, but whatever it was a bill that was thousands of pages long. And if you had done a quick scan of the table of contents, you wouldn't have seen the word Belarus in there anywhere. So if this was something that a member of Congress was on the lookout for, they wouldn't be able to easily spot it in the short amount of time that they had to read this multiple 1,000-page bill. It was really buried in there. And so my question for the Patriot Act was, were there things that were obvious from the table of contents that were red flags? And the answer is absolutely yes, because Section 412 raised an enormous red flag right in the title. Section 412's title is Mandatory Detention of Suspected Terrorists, Habeas Corpus, Judicial Review. So right there, mandatory detention of suspected terrorists, that I knew was a section that I wanted to read. And I'm glad I did. Because what it said is that the Attorney General is allowed to certify that an alien, that's their word, not mine, but an alien, which I interpret to mean is a foreigner, is engaged in, quote, any, unquote, activity that, quote, endangers the national security of the United States, unquote. Once the Attorney General makes that certification, there's really no proof of anything needed here. That alien, quote, shall, unquote, be taken into custody by the Attorney General. Then that person, quote, shall, unquote, meaning they must be held until they can be removed from the United States or until the Attorney General says they're not endangering our national security anymore. Now, here's the indefinite detention part. If that person can't be removed from the country for any reason, so like if no other country is willing to take them, or if they don't have citizenship in another country, because people like that exist, actually quite a few people like that exist, well, then their detention may be maintained, it's up to the Attorney General, quote, for additional periods of up to 6 months, unquote. Periods. That's plural. And there was no limit to that game. So basically, they can be kept locked up, no trials, nothing, just locked up for 6 months at a time, over and over again, until the Attorney General decides that they're not endangering our national security or, quote, the safety of the community or any person, unquote. And remember that person in United States laws has been interpreted to mean companies. So this person can't endanger any company as well. And so the wording of this was very reckless, and it was very obvious in the first 5 minutes of me looking into the Patriot Act. And then on top of that, this provision then limits the courts that can have jurisdiction over these matters and limits the appeals process. And what's really disturbing is that I found this unchanged in current law. And so this has just been sitting there for 20 years. Now, we know that we do have people in indefinite detention. This is something that I think is common knowledge, and if it isn't, it sure should be. But we have people that we have held for decades now without trials in our prison in Cuba, in Guantanamo Bay. But they have been detained using other laws that were recklessly created after 9/11. Turns out that Section 412 of the Patriot Act was never used until it was. And it has been used recently to keep one man. His name is Adham Hassan, and I'm probably saying that incorrectly, so I apologize. But Adham Hassan was locked up indefinitely after he had served his prison time here in the United States. So his deal is that he was born in Lebanon, but he was actually Palestinian. And we don't really acknowledge that Palestine is a country or has a real government because Israel controls the land and the people in the place that many of us think is a country called Palestine, but it's really not. So this guy, by being a Palestinian, he is officially stateless, which our government says is someone who's not an official citizen of any country. Now, this can happen to non-Palestinians as well. This isn't just like a Palestinian specific thing, because you can become stateless by, for example, having no birth certificate or registration with any government. You can have this happen to you if your country has been taken over in a war, which is actually what happened to the Palestinians. But this can happen if you have weird citizenship laws in your country where you lose your citizenship in some way. This can happen to you because your parents fall into this category. So if you are the children of people that weren't citizens, then you're not a citizen of anywhere. And all of a sudden you're stateless too. And so it turns out that being stateless is actually kind of a common thing in this world. And so this dude was stateless, but he had a visa that he used to come here legally in 1990 as a student. And what he did is he just didn't leave. He overstayed his visa. Now, to be honest with you, I don't really know his entire backstory. I don't know what he actually did or didn't do, because I didn't take the time to get into the weeds on his case. What I do know is that he sent money to organizations involved in conflicts in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya. And those are all countries that we have fucked with that I also don't really know the story on, to be honest with you. I know that President Clinton bombed Kosovo, and I know that those Boston Marathon fuckers bombed us because of something having to do with Chechnya. And so we have recent history in those areas, but when this happened, I was a kid, and I'm just going to be straight with you about what I don't know. I haven't educated myself all that deep on what happened in those areas in the 1990s. Like, I'm still trying to wrap my head on what happened in this country post 9/11. So the 90s, when I was a child, I honestly just don't know. But this guy, Adham Hussain, he was into all of that enough to be sending money to organizations, and he was being tracked by the FBI. So in 2002, a couple months after 9/11, he was arrested by immigration for overstaying his student visa, and he was charged with terrorism stuff over a year later in January of 2004. So we just held him that entire time. And I don't know the details of his terrorism charges, but a federal judge recently said that there were, quote, no specific identifiable victims of his crimes, and that the FBI had known what he was doing for years before arresting him, unquote. And so knowing that the judge in this case sees the situation in that way, what I can tell you is Adham Hussain was convicted of conspiracy to murder, kidnap, and maim persons in a foreign country. He was convicted of conspiracy to provide material support for terrorism, and he was convicted of providing material support to terrorists. Providing material support means sending money. And for these crimes, he received 15 years and 8 months in prison. Now, what I do find interesting about this is with the crimes he was convicted of, life sentences were options here. But the judge chose not to give him a life sentence because of a lack of evidence. That's the judge's term, not mine. Because of a lack of evidence tying him to any act of violence or plots to harm our government. And so instead of getting a life sentence, he was given 15 years, 8 months, and he served every second of that sentence. And so at the end of 2017, he had served his time and was scheduled to be deported out of the country. The only problem is that he's one of these stateless people and therefore had nowhere to go. He wasn't an official citizen of anywhere, and so other countries weren't willing to take him. I mean, one of the things that I read about this is that a lot of countries were actually down with him being there. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that the United States wanted us to pretty much spy on him at all times, and the countries weren't willing to do that. And so what the Trump administration decided to do was to keep him in his cell for 2 extra years using Section 412 of the Patriot Act to do it. And this was done because, just like I explained, the Patriot Act made it possible for the Attorney General to certify that Adham was a threat to national security, which put him in that 6-month cycle. And so every 6 months, the Attorney General just has to go, yep, he's a threat, providing no proof of that whatsoever. And then he just loses 6 more months of his freedom to live his life outside of our cages. And so he sued our government, and he won. So last year, in June of 2020, a federal judge in New York said the government couldn't prove that he would be a danger in the future. And so the government was forced by our Justice Department to let him go. Now, the point here is that he spent an extra 17 months in a cage and was eventually taken by, it appears to be, Rwanda. And he was the first person detained under the Patriot Act's indefinite detention provision, and he won. So finding this out, I mean, I actually feel pretty good because our judicial system worked. And so I actually think that's kind of great. And it's good to see, because how many times have we seen ourselves be disappointed in the way that our system works? So yes, our system worked. But the problem is that this law, Section 412 of the Patriot Act, it's still on the books, unchanged, in its original Patriot Act form. And so I'm thinking that we should take it off the books and not give the next administration that wants to find a reason to hold someone in a cage forever, let's not give them a chance to test this again. So that's one actionable thing we can do here, is get the Patriot Act's one provision, there was only one, authorizing indefinite detention, removed from our laws, because it's still there. The other thing that we also need to do, though, is identify all of the laws that allowed indefinite detention and also target them for elimination. Because like I said, it wasn't the Patriot Act alone that legalized indefinite detention by our government. This one provision has actually only been used one time and didn't work out in the government's favor in court. It was actually the authorization for the use of military force, which was passed literal days after 9/11. And that's the infamous one paragraph that's authorized at least 7 wars and countless drone bombings in I don't even know how many countries. It's the paragraph that sets up other humans to be labeled as enemy combatants, which then causes them to lose just about all their rights as far as our government is concerned. And that is really what has led to all of this indefinite detention, including the 39 people who have been held in Guantanamo Bay for almost 20 years now with no trial. In fact, 10 of those people have actually been cleared already for release. But again, just like what happened with Adham, other countries don't want to take them and have to spy on them all the time like the US is demanding. And so they're just staying in our cages year after year. And it's the authorization for military force that's the authorization for that. So that needs to be repealed to legally solve or begin to solve this indefinite cage time problem that we have here in the United States. But anyway, back to the Patriot Act. We're going to shift gears here from, our physical war powers authorized by the Patriot Act to the economic war powers. Because like I said, it was the Patriot Act, and I didn't know this, that authorized so much of the sanctions enforcement that I studied for the Safe Haven of Sanctions Evaders episode, which is when I learned that we created this whole system for preventing people and countries, whole countries, from being able to access their bank accounts and in many cases straight up stealing their shit. So I didn't quite realize the authorizations we had given our government to take other countries' shit until the Venezuela regime change attempt that started in 2017 by the Trump administration. Those episodes are fascinating. But essentially, we just cut off Venezuela from its bank accounts in other countries, and it no longer has access to its own gold. How did our government get the power to do that? Well, the Patriot Act is at least partially responsible because it's the 300s section of the Patriot Act that really created FinCEN in its current form. So FinCEN is the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and it was the Patriot Act that made that an official bureau in the Treasury Department. It also created the system used by the Treasury Department to share information to and from the private banks, and gives the banks immunity for sharing their customers' information, our information, with the government. It's also the Patriot Act that prohibits the bank from telling its customers, from telling us when they've handed our information over to the government. And so basically, they are legally immune from any lawsuits that result from them taking our bank records and giving them to the government. Like, we don't even know if that happens. And it's the Patriot Act that did that. And it was also the Patriot Act that gives the president some crazy broad sanctions authority. So like the president can target, quote, any person, unquote, or quote, any property, unquote, in the United States' jurisdiction. The president can also block people from taking possession of their own money and property. And he can also take people's money or possessions in some cases and keep them if the U.S. has been attacked by foreign nationals. But we also know how broadly we define attack. It doesn't necessarily mean that anyone is physically hurt or dies or anything. We're counting cyber crimes as official attacks. It's a broader word than it might seem on first glance. It's also the Patriot Act that made it so that the government is told, FinCEN is told, about any transaction that's over $10,000. And it also makes it a crime to secretly travel with more than $10,000 in cash over international borders, and makes that punishable by 5 years in prison, and they can take your money. And I've always wondered about this because when I fly back and forth to Europe or Mexico or South America or wherever I've been, we get those custom forms, right? The stewardesses, or am I not allowed to gender identify the people on the planes? What do we call them now? Flight attendants. How's that? The flight attendants will come with these forms, but never a pen. God forbid they give us a pen to actually fill out the forms. But they give you the forms, and somewhere on that form, it always says, do you have $10,000 in cash? And I'm like, no, why the fuck would I be traveling with $10,000 in cash? Well, this is why. So we have to declare that, because if we don't tell the government that we have it, then we can be punished by up to 5 years in a cage. That was the Patriot Act that did that. The Patriot Act also allows the person whose shit is being taken to challenge that in court. But the government in those cases is allowed to use evidence that would otherwise be inadmissible, quote, if compliance with the federal rules of evidence may jeopardize the national security interests of the United States, unquote. So that's all kinds of shady. This also gives very harsh penalties to banks that don't comply. And what's also kind of crazy is, like, if funds are deposited by a suspect into an account at a foreign bank that has an account in the United States, then the money in the bank's account, so not like the criminal or the suspected criminal, because we're not talking about the people who have been convicted of anything here. The suspected criminal's account is not the one targeted. It's the bank's account. Our government has given itself the authority to be able to take the amount deposited in the suspected criminal's account in the foreign country. They can take that from the bank's account instead. And then if that foreign bank doesn't terminate their relationship with the suspect, again, we're not talking about convicted criminals here. If they don't kill the account of the suspect, then that foreign bank can be fined up to $10,000 per day until they cancel that customer. That is an extreme expansion of our government's powers over the financial system. And I didn't know about it until last couple months. And it's even more extreme when you look at all of the provisions at one time in the Patriot Act. And I just want to take a few minutes here just to show you the real world implications of this in other countries, the level of control that this is allowing our country to have over the internal affairs of other countries about things that have absolutely nothing to do with us and shouldn't be any of our business. So, for example, the Patriot Act, as part of this whole, sanctions authorizing part of the bill law, well, it says that banks can't serve accounts that are complicit in any offense that, quote, involves the manufacture, importation, sale, or distribution of a controlled substance, as that term is defined for purposes of the Controlled Substances Act, unquote. It also expands the government's power to seize property held in the United States if the property was obtained via felony drug offenses, if the offense would be punishable by death or more than 1 year in prison under the foreign countries or the United States' laws. Now, there are a lot of places here in the United States where a teeny amount of marijuana in your possessions will get you more than 1 year in prison. So all of this catches any country that wants to legalize marijuana in its web. One example country is Uruguay. So in 2013, Uruguay passed a marijuana legalization law. But by 2018, a full 5 years later, only 14 of the country's estimated 1,200 pharmacies had registered to sell cannabis. And so what's happening in Uruguay is that people are having a really tough time getting it legally, like they're supposed to be able to based on what they voted for. There's long lines at those 14 pharmacies and millions of frustrated people in the country who want to be able to get marijuana the way I can here in California. Well, the reason this is happening is that most banks in Uruguay route their international transactions through banks in the United States, which means that their banks fall under the Patriot Act's provisions. And so these banks are afraid of the Patriot Act, and therefore banks like, huge ones like Citibank are threatening to pull out of Uruguay's banking system altogether so that they don't get in trouble for facilitating what we're saying is felony drug offenses, even though we're only talking about marijuana here in a country that is not ours. And so basically, Uruguay's government has had a choice. Their choice is they can shut down the cannabis selling pharmacies or risk the withdrawal of major American financial institutions from that country. And so what they decided to do is they allow the pharmacies to make their own decisions. But basically, what is happening is that the Uruguayan banks told the weed stores that their accounts would be closed with the banks. And so anyone who wants to operate a pharmacy that sells weed in Uruguay really has no choice but to operate in all cash, which essentially makes those stores excellent targets for robberies, and everybody knows it. And so very few of the pharmacies, 14 to be exact, are willing to take the risks that come with an all cash business. And so even though Uruguay voted to legalize marijuana 8 years ago, it's almost impossible to get legally in that country. And so essentially what we're finding is that the Patriot Act is stopping people from being able to get regulated, safe marijuana in Uruguay. And what that is also having the effect of doing, even though the Patriot Act is supposedly giving our government more power, but it's actually weakening our country as a ruler of the world, because now Uruguay is considering switching from using US banks as their multinational intermediary to Canadian banks, because that would get them out of our web and the Patriot Act's control. So it's actually diminishing our power on the world stage because it's having these effects where, regular people can't get what they voted for because of our psychotic laws. So all of that sanction stuff and the indefinite detention provisions and a lot more of the Patriot Act, a lot of it, which actually wasn't that big of a deal, but most of the Patriot Act, like I said, this is important, was permanent right away. 90% of it, to be exact, was permanent right away and therefore never reevaluated. And so every time you've heard over the years that, the Patriot Act is expiring, and we've had these, national conversations about, data collection and all that, and we've just labeled that the Patriot Act, we're talking about 10% of the Patriot Act or less every single time we had that national conversation. And this happened quite a few times. And so the reauthorizations that were needed were, again, only for part of the law. And that's because of the Democratic Party. Let's at least give them credit for that. That when the Patriot Act was being written, the Democrats, they saw some controversial provisions. Somehow they missed Section 412 and the indefinite detention, but they saw some controversial provisions and said, we at least want a sunset date on some of these so that we can reevaluate whether or not we want to keep these permissions in law. And so the original sunset date was for the end of 2005. Then when those expired, they were short-term extended to February 2006 and then to March of 2006. And then eventually in March of 2006, there was a compromise signed into law by George W. Bush. But the compromise essentially made the vast majority of the things that we wanted to reevaluate permanent. So in 2006, the parts that were supposed to be reevaluated but just were made permanent were the parts of the Patriot Act that allows judges to issue warrants outside of the districts where the property to be searched is located. They made permanent the part that says that the government can delay notifying their target about a warrant that they got if the court finds that the notification, quote, may have an adverse result, unquote, such as jeopardizing the investigation, which, of course it would. So essentially, the Patriot Act authorizes secret warrants, and they made that permanent. They also made permanent in 2006 allowing sneak and peek warrants, which allowed the government to secretly enter, either physically or electronically, a person's property to search, take pictures, copy documents, download files, do stuff like that, as long as they don't take any physical property with them. So it's they can download the contents of a computer as long as the physical computer stays in the house. And again, these warrants can be secret. That was made permanent. They also made permanent the part of the Patriot Act that requires the courts to authorize the installation of trace devices, quote, anywhere within the United States, unquote, if the court finds that the government has shown that the information that would likely be obtained from the devices, quote, is relevant to an ongoing criminal investigation, unquote. These orders, quote, shall apply to any personnel or entity providing wire or electronic communication services in the United States, unquote. And because these functions are commonly performed today by software instead of physical mechanisms, this section allows these tracing devices to be attached or applied to the target facility. And it pays the communication companies to help the government spy in this way. And I can't help but remember that in 2007 is when I really started paying attention to what was going on in Congress. And that's when I learned that there was a technician who worked for AT&T. He became a whistleblower because he personally installed tracing devices on AT&T's wires that copied everything that went over them and sent them to the government. I read this and I'm like, oh, so that's how they thought that could possibly be legal, to copy all digital information and send it to the government to be stored and searched in later. Here it is. It was the Patriot Act that sort of made that legal. And so, yeah, that was the stuff that was controversial, and they just made it permanent in 2006. The compromise in that situation is that there were 3 provisions that were given expiration dates again. And so, and those 3 provisions were the lone wolf provision of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004, which permitted the FISA court. So that's a court that has actually been really controversial since the beginning, because it allows law enforcement agents who are looking into like terrorism and like spook shit to go to a secret court to get warrants. So the FISA court has always been pretty controversial, and it allows these FISA courts to authorize surveillance and physical searches aimed at foreign people who are, quote, engaged in international terrorism or activities in preparation for international terrorism, unquote. Now, the thing about the lone wolf provision is I don't really want to get into it because it's apparently never been used and it's officially expired. So let's not worry about that. There were 2 other provisions, though, that were a big deal and did have a lot of real world implications that were extended until the end of 2009 that also have to do with the FISA courts. And so basically, the 2 provisions that were extended until 2009 that matter were the roving wiretaps. That's kind of the nickname for them, where basically if a person was branded as, quote, a foreign power or an agent of a foreign power, unquote, the government was able to authorize wiretapping, quote, a common carrier. So that's like AT&T. That's like your entire phone company. A common carrier, landlord, custodian, or other specified person, unquote. And again, person in U.S. law means company. If the court finds that the target is using communications that, quote, may have the effect of thwarting the identification, unquote, of the target. So basically, if someone is, we don't really have landlines anymore. I mean, some people have landlines, like your grandma probably has a landline, but most of us are using cell phones. And so this is what allowed them to tap into any other kind of communication that the person could use. But the problem is, like, if you're tapping into, like, here's a target, this person works at Amazon, for instance, they were using this to tap everyone in that Amazon warehouse. Like, it was so broad. They'd be like, oh, this person might use a phone here and therefore tap all the phones. So that was that provision. And then there was another provision that was extended to 2009, that's Section 215. And Section 215 authorizes the FBI to order, quote, the production of any tangible items, unquote, for their investigations into international terrorism, as long as the investigation of a U.S. citizen or company, quote, is not conducted solely upon the basis of activities protected by the First Amendment to the Constitution, unquote. So this is the one that's been facilitating the mass collection of our information from phone companies and internet companies, our call records, stuff like that, because this is how the government has been going to these companies and being like, give us all your phone records because we're trying to make connections on foreign people. And the information about the Americans, that's just, we're getting that kind of on accident. So don't worry about it. Like, that's what Section 215 was authorizing. Really, a lot of the things that we learned from the Edward Snowden documents about how much information they were collecting from all these companies, like Facebook and all the phone companies and the tech companies, like they were funneling all this information to the government. It was Section 215 that did that. And on top of that, the reason this was all secret until Edward Snowden told us about it is that the company turning over the property is not allowed, or wasn't allowed, to tell anyone that they gave the FBI whatever they requested. And then in return for keeping their mouths shut, they couldn't be sued by any of us peasants for turning over our information. So those 2 provisions had big time consequences. And there's a lot of people that are being targeted by this shit. So like in 2018 alone, there were 1,833 targets of FISA orders, including 232 Americans. So to say that Americans are not a part of this is just total bullshit. And again, a target of a FISA order, there's so much information that's collected about other people that come in contact with them, either on purpose or incidentally, that gets swept up in these nets as well. So those were the two provisions. When you heard about the Patriot Act expiring, most of the time, those were the two provisions that we were talking about. All those years, we were just talking really about two provisions. So like I said, those expired in 2009. And in the years that followed, they were extended 5 more times. But those Edward Snowden document releases made a big difference because that is when the world realized that the United States was using these provisions to spy on it, pretty much collecting all of the world's digital traffic. And so that's what led to the changes in the USA Freedom Act that was signed into law in the summer of 2015. And again, I highly recommend you listen to that episode to really understand those changes. But essentially what the USA Freedom Act did is it just privatized the storage. So instead of the government being able to put a trapping device on the AT&T wires and ship all of the digital information to their data warehouses, like there was a giant one that they built. It was like a whole fucking city full of data storage warehouses in the desert in Utah, where they were just storing all of this information and then they would just look into it when they needed to. So instead of doing that, the USA Freedom Act said, okay, the private companies are going to hold on to the information now. We're going to pay them to do so. And then when we request the information, the private companies are going to give it to us. So we privatized the storage. And that's essentially, like, if you boil it down, what the USA Freedom Act did. But then a few years after that, in 2018, there was a Supreme Court case that also changed the situation. Because in 2018, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that a warrant is required for law enforcement to access historical cell site location information. So like physical information about where we are. So the thing about that ruling, and this is according to, I want to tell you who this is. Her name is Sharon Bradford Franklin. And from the fall of 2013, so like around the Edward Snowden document time through January 2017, she served as the executive director of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, which is an independent federal agency that reviews counterterrorism programs to make sure that they have appropriate safeguards for privacy and civil liberties. And she found that ours fucking don't. So she said that after this Supreme Court decision, the effects of this is that call detail records, which shows over time, who calls whom and when, that exposes intimate personal details and patterns of association, very similar levels of privacy risks that the cell site location information would provide. And so what she said is that this ruling, not only, even though it was really about the cell site location, this ruling showed that the Fourth Amendment still protects our privacy. And therefore, these call and text records that these two sections were allowing the government to access, that's pretty unconstitutional as well. So what they call that is the third party doctrine, which essentially the government was saying that our Fourth Amendment rights, which protect us from illegal search and seizure, the third party doctrine basically said that those are dead when we share information with third parties, like a phone company or an internet company or our banks or whatever. And this Supreme Court ruling in 2018 essentially ruled that to be bullshit, which really does make Section 215 officially unconstitutional. And so after that court case, in the midst of the chaos that was the beginning of COVID and the chaos of Trump being in charge of that crisis, the data collection, roving wiretaps, and lone wolf sections of the Patriot Act were actually allowed to expire. They just didn't do anything. And as of this recording, they remain expired. Now, one of the things I do have to tell you, though, because the vast majority of people in this current Congress are the same ones that were in the Congress in 2020 that let these provisions expire, they were working on renewing them. It's not like they wanted them to expire. But remember how the House of Representatives just like f***ed off for months at the beginning of COVID? Just like left the whole country in the oh so competent tiny hands of Donald Trump? Remember how they just abdicated the responsibility of the country and all went back to their big fancy mansion homes instead of staying in DC and doing their jobs of running the country? Remember that? They were gone for months. I was screaming about it. I was so angry. Well, it turns out the Patriot Act provisions fell through that crack when they decided to go home instead of staying in DC and doing their jobs. And so, like I said, as of this recording, they're still expired. And in my opinion, good fucking riddance. But here's the thing. There's always a thing. But there's actually good reason to believe that the spying has continued regardless of their expiration. Because first of all, those Patriot Act provisions, they overlap spying authorities that were granted in other laws and executive orders. In fact, one of the executive orders that's authorizing all this shit has been in effect since the early Reagan years. And the Patriot Act provisions themselves can continue to be used for ongoing investigations that existed before March 15th, 2020, which is when they officially expired. And, we've had investigations going on for decades. Like the investigation into Al-Qaeda has been used to justify bombing people in like Syria, So it's like we've had these ongoing super broad investigations. They basically just have to claim terrorism in going after a target and they can just keep doing what they're doing. And so to actually get the spying to stop, there needs to be repeals, not expirations of these provisions and others. And on top of that, I've discovered that we also need some new laws to be written because even though Section 215 is officially expired and the Supreme Court ruled that collecting our location data and in a way, our cell phone and text data from phone and internet companies is unconstitutional, the government has found a workaround because we now know that the government is purchasing data from marketing firms instead of going to courts for warrants. So think about all the apps on your phone that track your location and your phone number and your email address. They collect all kinds of information. Even knowing this right now, I still have ones on my phone that track my location. Like the one that I downloaded this morning, UC Berkeley has an app that is used to give you earthquake notifications. So like if there's an earthquake, and I know this sounds like it might not work, but if there's an earthquake somewhere, it's meant to buzz people within a range where you could feel it to at least give you a couple seconds warning that there's an earthquake happening. And I actually believe in this technology because back in 1994, the Northridge earthquake, I was living in Irvine, which is like, 50, 60 miles away from where Northridge was from the epicenter. We were living in Orange County, definitely felt that earthquake, but we had a cousin that was living in Simi Valley, which is basically like next door to the epicenter. And so my mom was on the phone with our cousin and my cousin goes, "Oh, it's happening again." And then like 30 seconds later, we started to feel the wave. And so my mom was on the phone and said, "Girls, it might start shaking again. Prepare yourselves." And sure enough, when that one came, it was way less scary because we knew that it was coming. And we just kind of like sat on the bed. We knew that there was nothing that could fall on us. And it was the only earthquake in my life that actually didn't make me scared because I knew it was coming. And so that's the idea behind this app. But in order to have this work, that app has to know where I am. So I am giving my location data to UC Berkeley and whoever else they work with to make that app work. I don't know if they're selling the information. I didn't read the terms of service because who reads the fucking terms of service? There's also apps like Pizza Hut and Domino's and El Pollo Loco. My Chipotle app certainly knows where I am. And Google Maps? Of course Google Maps knows where I am. How else am I supposed to use my Google Maps if it doesn't know where I am? So we have all of these apps on our phones that have all kinds of information about us. And so when we think about that data tracking in the private sector, we're thinking like, yeah, I need to use my Google Maps. I want to know where the closest Chipotle is to me at all times. What we know is that they collect that information and then they sell it to other places to target us with ads. And it's super annoying, but who cares, right? Well, it turns out that the government is buying that same data from Facebook, Google, Pizza Hut, whatever brokers they sell the information to, and the credit reporting agencies, all of these companies that make billions of dollars collecting our information and selling it to anyone willing to pay. Well, it turns out the government is willing to pay. So for example, the Department of Homeland Security, during the Trump administration, we found out that they were using location data that they bought from the private market for immigration and border enforcement. Specifically buying location data that maps the movements of our cell phones that comes from apps that we use to play games, check the weather, do our shopping, order food, all that stuff. And they were using the location data to track down people moving around unusual places near the border. Then there's the Defense Intelligence Agency, the military spooks. They appear to be buying and using location data for investigations about foreigners overseas. because they want to protect our bases and our spooks overseas. But a lot of their information buys are classified. So we don't really even know what information they're getting and what they're doing with it. However, we do know that the broker that the Defense Intelligence Agency uses, the company with all of our information that it's selling, that broker doesn't separate foreign information from American information. And so apparently the system that the military spooks are using is that they buy up all this data and then they separate what they get into two different databases, one with information on foreigners and one with information about Americans. And then to search the database with American information, the spooks have to get some kind of special approval. But the point is that they have a database full of American information in the first place. And we don't know exactly what they're doing with it. Think of the possibilities. For example, Vice recently reported on their Motherboard blog that Muslim Pro, which is an app for Muslim prayers, Muslim Pro sold its data to a broker who then sold it to the defense contractors that work with the military. And you might not be a Muslim, but do you think the government might have some interest in purchasing the data from, for instance, maybe some of the Jesus-y apps? Now that the MAGA folks are considered domestic terrorists, we could all get caught up in this. And right now, there is no law in the book saying that they can't just buy our data. So we pay taxes for them to then use our money to buy information to spy on us. Like, I would like for that to be shut the fuck down. And I don't think there's anyone even working on that, not that I know of. And so now that we know what was in it and what it unleashed, I think it's just very clear that the Patriot Act is infamous for a reason. I mean, if you were to go down the street and just ask any American, can you give us an example of a bad law, a law that you hate that most people would want to see repealed? I think a lot of people would say the Patriot Act, even if they haven't read it provision by provision like I have. Even if they didn't even know that 90% of it was permanent right off the bat. I think everybody kind of knows that we lost our Fourth Amendment rights, and it was because of the Patriot Act, and we're still dealing with that to this day. And so as I look back on it 20 years later, and I wonder, can we hold it against people who voted yes? Like, did they know what was in it? After looking at this, and especially after finding that indefinite detention provision after 5 minutes, it wouldn't have been that hard to see the problems with the sanctions provisions and certainly, Section 206 and 215 with the bulk collection of data. I mean, a quick overview of just the table of contents would have given me enough pause on enough provisions to be like, hold up, wait a minute, I can't clear this to become law right now. And so my answer is that, yes, I feel like 20 years later, we can hold this vote against people because people should have known better. And in fact, some people did. So at the time that the Patriot Act passed, this was in the 107th Congress, the House of Representatives at the time was controlled by Republicans, and the Senate was controlled by the Democrats. And so I do have to tell you that this effort to make the Patriot Act law was definitely bipartisan. The bill that became law was introduced on the morning of October 23rd, 2001, and it was law by October 26th. That's pretty fast. And the debate in the House of Representatives took place the same afternoon that it was introduced. And that debate lasted for exactly 1 hour and 12 minutes. Now, a lot of the debate sounded like this. Here's ex-Representative Spencer Baucus.
We may not have understood and appreciated the word terrorism and what terrorists were before September 11th. But we certainly do today. We know who they are. We know what they're capable of. We may not have appreciated the need for this legislation before September 11th, but surely today we appreciate the need for this legislation and the urgency of such legislation.
There was a lot of that. 9/11, 9/11, 9/11, it was so bad, so we have to do this right now as fast as we can. There was a lot of that. But even if they weren't looking at like the substance of the bill at that time, there was plenty of reason to slow down. So here's Representative Bobby Scott, who is still a representative from Virginia.
First of all, I think it's appropriate to comment on the process by which the bill is coming to us. This is not the bill that was reported and deliberated on in the Judiciary Committee. It came to us laid on the floor. No one has really had an opportunity to look at the bill to see what's in it since we've been out of our offices. The report has just come to us, and it would be helpful if we'd wait for some period of time so that we can at least review what we're voting on. But I guess that's not going to stop us, so here we go.
So yeah, it's kind of nuts that the Patriot Act actually did originate sort of from a committee. But here's what happened. Here is who was then on the Judiciary Committee. This was ex-Representative John Conyers.
The members of the Judiciary Committee who had a free and open debate, and then we came to a bill that, even though imperfect, was unanimously agreed on. That was removed from us, and we are now debating at this hour of night with only 2 copies of the bill that we are being asked to vote on are available to the members on this side of the aisle.
So yeah, the Judiciary Committee had created a version of the Patriot Act, and that's what originally passed the House of Representatives. They actually had 2 votes. But then there was the Senate version, and they were supposed to go to a conference. Now, this might sound really familiar because in the last main episode, I was talking about the infrastructure bill. This is the same shit where you have one from the House and one from the Senate. They're supposed to go to a conference and be merged and worked on and carefully crafted. And that part was skipped. Just like with the infrastructure bill in this Congress 10 years ago. Nope. 20 years ago. The same shit was going on with the Patriot Act. And so what they were voting on this day, the final text, was not the one that they had worked on in their committee. It was not the one that they had agreed on with anyone. It just showed up out of nowhere. And 20 years ago, we all didn't have computers in our pockets the way we do now. So they couldn't just read the text online the way I can. They only had 2 printed copies for all of the Democrats to read before the debate. That's pretty horrible. You also heard Bobby Scott mention we had been out of our offices, and that's because in the days preceding the Patriot Act becoming law, there had been an anthrax attack. And so our members of Congress weren't physically in their offices to get their work done. They were gone. So this process, it is just as shameful 20 years ago as it is now, which doesn't make me feel any better about anything. But it does kind of answer a question about how these provisions were able to become law despite being so obviously problematic. But I'm still going to hold it against people because I feel like the process itself is a reason to vote no in these circumstances. And so, kind of along those lines, listen to this floor speech from ex-Representative Barney Frank of Massachusetts, because I think he put it pretty well.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know how I'm going to vote on this bill yet because I have this notion that in a bill of this way, they ought to read it. So what I want to talk about now is my deep disappointment at the procedure. The gentleman from Wisconsin, the chair of the committee, has fought hard for a fair chance for the members to look at things. But on the whole, his efforts have not been honored. We now, for the second time, are debating on the floor a bill of very profound significance for the constitutional structure and security of our country. And in neither case has any member been allowed to offer a single amendment. At no point in the debate in this very profound set of issues have we had a procedure whereby the most democratic institution in our government, the House of Representatives, engages in democracy. Who decided that to defend democracy we had to degrade it? Who decided that the very openness and participation and debate and weighing of issues, who decided that was a defect at a time of crisis? This is a chance for us to show the world that democracy is a source of strength, that with our military strength and our determination and our unity of purpose goes a continued respect for the profound way in which a democracy functions. And this bill, ironically, this bill, which has been given all these high-flying acronyms, it's the Patriot bill, it's the USA bill, it's the Stand Up and Sing the Star-Spangled Banner bill, has been debated in the most undemocratic way possible. And that's not worthy of this institution.
So the process alone warranted a no vote. Because how can you vote yes on something that they knew was this significant? Clearly they knew it was significant without having a chance to actually read it. But like I said, I saw very quickly that there were problems in it, and I wasn't the only one. So here's Representative Bobby Scott again.
This bill makes three significant changes. One, it reduces standards for getting a foreign intelligence wiretap from one where it is a primary, the reason you're getting it, to it is a significant reason for getting the wiretap. Much less. And you wonder, well, if it's not the primary reason, why are you getting the wiretap? Second, it allows the roving wiretap. So once you find a target, if he's using cell phones, for example, you can go and find him wherever he is. And third, you can use the information in a criminal investigation. And the combination gives you the situation where there's very little standard and you can essentially conduct a criminal investigation without probable cause. If you have, for example, a target who is using cell phones, and you get the wiretap, he uses a payphone. You can listen to anybody using the payphone. If he's in a club or organizational in a business, you can go and tap the phones there. If he's visiting the Democratic National Headquarters, maybe you can tap all the phones there.
And he continued.
There are provisions that allow detention under certain circumstances that may be indefinite. We expand the ability of the government to conduct secret searches, the so-called sneak and peek, where you don't tell people you even investigated. And you can start targeting domestic organizations, designating domestic groups as terrorist groups. And you can start getting the CIA into designating these groups as target for criminal investigations. There's a lot in this bill that we have not appropriately considered, and that's why we need more time to think of it, because it goes way past terrorism. This is the way you're going to be conducting criminal investigations, and therefore the bill ought to be defeated.
Gentleman's time has expired.
People knew, and they said it out loud. So anyone in Congress that said that they didn't know what the repercussions could be were either not in the debate or they're lying. And so that was Representative Bobby Scott of Virginia, who again, 20 years later is still there. But we have other people that were still there. So here's Representative Zoe Lofgren of California, a Democrat who's also still in Congress. And this is how she participated in that debate.
I would also like to note, however, that there's been a lot of loose language among people who oppose this bill, and people are perfectly, free to disagree with it, but it's important that we not be incorrect about what's actually in the bill. I actually heard someone say that the bill would provide for indefinite incarceration on a mere suspicion by the Attorney General. That's simply not the case. The Attorney General may detain persons, but he has to certify and he has to have reasonable grounds to believe that the individuals are involved in terrorism, and that decision is reviewable by a court. So that is really to say it's mere suspicion and indefinite is certainly not the case.
So she was wrong. She minimized what was in that provision. We had a human being using that provision who was kept in jail for an extra 17 months after his prison sentence expired, and the court said it was unconstitutional. So she, 20 years ago, was fucking wrong. Her name is Representative Zoe Lofgren of California. Remember that name. It's going to come up again. But basically, here's the guy that wrote the Patriot Act. He's a Republican named ex-Representative James Sensenbrenner of Wisconsin. And this was the argument that won the day.
Mr. Speaker, this is the latest step in a long process to attempt to pass a bill and send to the President that is vitally needed. It is vitally needed by our law enforcement officials who are fighting the battle at home. We don't know how this battle will be fought. We don't know what tactics the enemy will take. We don't know what agents the enemy will use. And what we need is we need to get the intelligence necessary to protect the people of the United States of America from whatever the enemy has planned up its sleeve.
And with that, it passed the House of Representatives the next morning. And then the day after that, it passed the Senate. And then it went to President George W. Bush to be signed the day after that. Now, the vote counts were in the House of Representatives 357 to 66. So there were quite a few people, almost all of them Democrats, who said no to this at the time. The case was different in the Senate, where it passed 98 to 1. The only senator who voted no was a Democrat who's no longer in Congress, Senator Russ Feingold. But basically, when it was all said and done, 99% of the Republicans voted yes on the Patriot Act, and 75% of the Democrats voted yes as well. And a lot of them, more than I ever imagined, are still in Congress. So let's talk about the people that voted yes, that we should hold it against them, that voted yes on the Patriot Act and are still in power. Starting with President Joe Biden, who voted yes on the Patriot Act as a senator. Talk about failing up. Then there were a bunch of Republicans in Congress. So right now we have 27 Republicans in Congress who were still in Congress after 20 years and who voted yes on the original one. So we have a few that voted yes on the Patriot Act as members of the House and have since been promoted to senator. They include Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas, Senator Susan Collins of Maine, Senator John Thune of South Dakota, and Senator Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania. There's a few more people who voted yes on the Patriot Act as members of the House of Representatives, were promoted to senator, and have been promoted even further to be in leadership positions. One of them is Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia, who is currently the top Republican on the Committee on Environment and Public Works. One of them is also Senator Richard Burr of North Carolina, who is now the top Republican on the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. We also have Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi, I believe. MS. Is that Mississippi's abbreviation? I don't know. But he is the co-chairman of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which means that this guy who voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago, despite knowing, or should having known, that it had the ability to stomp on all our rights, this is a guy that's coordinating our military and economic decisions with the rest of the world, specifically with 57 other countries. We also have Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, who was a member of the House of Representatives and voted yes on the Patriot Act and is now the top Republican on the Budget Committee, deciding where our money goes. We also have Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, who was also a member of the House of Representatives back when he voted for the Patriot Act, and he's now the top Republican on the Committee on Rules and Administration. So the guy with that level of good judgment is now deciding how the Senate should be run. Senator Rob Portman of Ohio was also a member of the House when he voted for the Patriot Act, and he's now the top Republican on the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which is a committee that is directly responsible for governing Patriot Act provisions. We also have Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma, who was a senator back then when he voted on the Patriot Act, remains a senator today, and is now the top Republican on the Armed Services Committee, making our decisions in war. I also kind of have to point out that he's the top Republican on the Committee on Environment and Public Works Subcommittee on Clean Air and Climate, despite being the member of Congress most devoted to fossil fuels, to the point that he brought a snowball into Congress to show that global warming isn't real. These are the kinds of people we have running our country. We also had Senator Mike Crapo, however you want to say it, of Idaho, who voted yes on the Patriot Act and is now the top Republican on the Finance Committee. Then there's Senator Richard Shelby of Alabama, voted yes on the Patriot Act and is now the top Republican on the Appropriations Committee. And therefore, he also sits on all 12 subcommittees and is one of the most influential people in this country determining what our tax money is spent on. We also have Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, who voted yes on the Patriot Act and is now the top Republican on the Senate Judiciary Committee. Still making decisions for us about the rule of law. And then, of course, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky voted yes on the Patriot Act, and he is now the top Republican in the Senate. Over in the House of Representatives, we have 5 Republicans who voted yes on the Patriot Act and are still there making our laws, including Sam Graves of Missouri, Frank Lucas of Oklahoma, Mike Simpson of Idaho, Fred Upton of Michigan, and Darrell Issa of California. We also have Representative Steve Chabot of Ohio, who is now the top Republican on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation. No big deals there. We also have Representative Chris Smith of New Jersey, who's the top Republican on the House Committee on Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Global Human Rights. Human rights. Voted yes on the Patriot Act and is governing global human rights. We also have Representative Ken Calvert of California, who's the top Republican on the House Committee on Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense, making more decisions 20 years later on matters of war. We also have Representative Harold Rogers of Kentucky, currently serving his 21st term in Congress, and he is the top Republican on the Appropriations Subcommittee on State, Foreign Affairs, and Related Programs. So he is still governing spook shit after voting yes on the Patriot Act. We also have the distinguished gentleman, Pete Sessions of Texas, who is the top Republican on the Committee on Oversight and Reform's Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee. He voted yes on the Patriot Act, which took away our Fourth Amendment rights completely. And he's governing civil rights and civil liberties 20 years later, you guys. What the hell? We also have Representative Kevin Brady of Texas, and he is a Patriot Act voter who is now the top Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, which determines how much we get taxed. And then we also have Representative Kay Granger of Texas, who voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago and has failed up to be the top Republican on the House Committee on Appropriations, which determines where our tax money goes. So like I said, 27 Republicans in this Congress voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago. It's even worse on the Democratic side. There are 40 Democrats that are in our current Congress that voted yes on the Patriot Act, and all but one of them in the Senate are in leadership positions. So the only senator that was voting yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago, but is not the chair of anything right now, is Senator Dianne Feinstein of California. But she sits on the Judiciary and Intelligence Committee, so it's not like she doesn't have power. But I'm guessing that she doesn't have a leadership position because it's also kind of well known that she's senile as shit. So she is not in a leadership position, but she's still there 20 years later. Now, this one's really disappointing to me, but Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts was a member of the House of Representatives when he voted yes on the Patriot Act. And that makes me sad because I really liked Ed Markey. I voted for him in Massachusetts, so I feel kind of responsible for this one. But he has failed up to be the chairman of the Senate's Committee on Foreign Relations Subcommittee on East Asia, the Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Policy. We also have Senator Ben Cardin of Maryland, who was a member of the House of Representatives when he voted yes on the Patriot Act. So he got promoted to senator, and now he is the chairman of the Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe. So I just want to point out that the top Democrat and top Republican who are coordinating our security with 57 other countries are both people that voted for the Patriot Act. And he's also the chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations Subcommittee on the State Department and USAID Management, International Operations, and Bilateral International Development. So this guy is a big player representing us on the world stage. We also have psychotic Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey, who voted yes on the Patriot Act as a member of the House of Representatives and is super devoted to all kinds of regime changes now that he's a senator and the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Also voting yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago is Senator Maria Cantwell of Washington, who's now the chairman of the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. Voting yes on the Patriot Act is also Tom Carper of Delaware. He is now the chairman of the Committee on Environment and Public Works and the chairman of the Finance Committee Subcommittee on Global Competitiveness. Senator Patty Murray of Washington also voted yes on the Patriot Act, and she has failed up to be the chair of the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions and the chair of the Appropriations Subcommittee on Labor, Health, Human Services, Education, and Related Agencies. There's also Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, which has been recently pointed out to me, looks like a wax figure in all of her pictures. And yet she's very much a human being and is still in Congress after 20 years after voting for the Patriot Act and is now the chairman of the Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry Committee and the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee on the Subcommittee on Health. This one also makes me sad because Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon voted yes on the Patriot Act. And it's really surprising to me because ever since he's actually been one of the voices trying to get, some of these powers reined in. And so I'm just really disappointed that he didn't have the foresight to stop this from becoming law to begin with. And now he is the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. We also have Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island. He voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago and is now the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. We also have Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. And back when the Patriot Act became law, he was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he voted yes on it. He even gave a very long speech about it. He knew every detail the day before it passed, and he voted yes. So that doesn't show good judgment. And now he's the Senate Appropriations Committee chairman, so he's determining where our money goes. We also have Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who is now the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Voted yes on the Patriot Act, failed up to be the chairman. And then we have Senator Chuck Schumer of New York, who is the head of the Senate, and he voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago. They all got promotions. It's insane. And then over in the House of Representatives, again, all but one of the people who voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago, all of them are now in leadership positions except for one. So I don't know what Representative Ron Kind of Wisconsin did to piss off Nancy Pelosi, but he's the only person who voted yes on the Patriot Act who's still in Congress who's not in the leadership position. So he must have a terrible personality, but I really have no way to back that up. But now let's get into the people that are leading the House of Representatives and who all voted yes on the Patriot Act. So we have Representative Rick Larsen of Washington, who's the chair of the Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Aviation. We have Representative Grace Napolitano of California, who's the chair of the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure Subcommittee on Water Resources and the Environment. We have Representative Brad Sherman of California, voted yes on the Patriot Act, and is now the chair of the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets. We have Representative James Langevin. I don't know how to say his name, but he's representing Rhode Island. There's only like two of them that represent Rhode Island. He's been there for 20 fucking years, voted yes on the Patriot Act, and he's now the chair of the Armed Services Committee Subcommittee on Cyber Innovative Technologies and Information Systems. This one's disappointing. Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina voted yes on the Patriot Act, and he is now the chair of the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. So no wonder it's going so well. We also have Representative Gregory Meeks of New York, who voted yes on the Patriot Act and is now the chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. And we have Representative Zoe Lofgren of California. You just heard her sound clip basically saying that Section 412 doesn't do exactly what it does by authorizing indefinite detention. She was wrong 20 years ago. She voted for the Patriot Act, and she's now the chair of the Committee on House Administration. So she's one of the people who determines how the House of Representatives runs. No wonder we are so disgusted with the process. We haven't fired any of these people. We've just promoted them. She's also now the chair of the House Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship. And again, they are using Patriot Act provisions to track people on the border. How has she been able to fail up to these positions? Also failing up to a position of mind-boggling power, despite being awful, is Representative Adam Schiff of California. He voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago and is now the chair of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And as I told you guys in the episode I did, it's been like a month or two now, not that long ago, but we looked at the bills that are currently floating around there that would go after domestic terrorists, basically using these Patriot Act provisions against Americans. And Adam Schiff's bill was the scariest. So, of course, he voted on the Patriot Act. We shouldn't even be surprised. We have two people that voted for the Patriot Act that are leaders on the Committee on Oversight and Reform. So first, we have Representative Stephen Lynch of Massachusetts. He is the chair of the Committee on Oversight and Reform Subcommittee on National Security, which is in the Patriot Act wheelhouse. And then we also have Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York, voted yes on the Patriot Act and is now the chair of House Oversight and Reform. We also have three people in leadership positions on the Energy and Commerce Committee that voted yes on the Patriot Act, including Representative Anna Eshoo of California, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Health. We have Representative Michael Doyle of Pennsylvania, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. And of course, we have Representative Frank Pallone of New Jersey, who voted yes on the Patriot Act and has failed up to be the chair of the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. Then there's the Committee on Ways and Means. Now, this is a very powerful committee that a lot of us don't really know about, but this was like, remember Paul Ryan, that nerd? Well, this was the committee that he chaired, and he loved it because this is the committee that writes our tax laws. It's also a very coveted committee because if you're writing tax laws, lobbyists want to talk to you a lot. And so it's also a very lucrative committee to be on. Well, we have 5 people in leadership positions on the Ways and Means Committee that all voted for the Patriot Act, including Representative Bill Pascrell of New Jersey, who is the chair of the Subcommittee on Oversight. We have Representative Mike Thompson of California, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Select Revenue Measures. We have Representative John Larson of Connecticut, who's the chair of the Subcommittee on Social Security. We have Representative Lloyd Doggett of Texas, who is the chair of the Subcommittee on Health. And of course, the chair of the whole committee, Representative Richie Neal of Massachusetts. He voted yes on the Patriot Act. He's also the chair of the Joint Committee on Taxation. So it is no exaggeration to say that the person who is the most influential in this country right now, determining how much money comes out of your pocket, is Representative Richie Neal of Massachusetts, and he's a Patriot Act voter. Talk about a fail-up. Then the Appropriations Committee, that one's even crazier. The Appropriations Committee is probably the most coveted committee in Congress because this is the committee that determines where our money goes. So Ways and Means determines how much of our money they take, and Appropriations determines where it goes. There's 12 subcommittees. So we've talked about government funding a whole bunch. So the Appropriations Committee, the main committee, does all the government funding. So these giant monster omnibus funding bills that fund the entire government that we see every December, and we're going to see another one this year too, that comes from the Appropriations Committee. There are 12 sections of government funding, each of them controlled by one subcommittee. So we're supposed to have 12 government funding bills every year, each of them originating in a subcommittee. Well, those subcommittees, we have 5 of the leaders are people who voted for the Patriot Act. And of course, the chairman of the entire House Appropriations Committee also voted for the Patriot Act. So real quick, Representative Marcy Kaptur of Ohio, she chairs the subcommittee that does funding for energy and water. Representative Betty McCollum of Minnesota, she chairs the subcommittee that takes care of the defense funding. We have Representative Sanford Bishop of Georgia, and he chairs the subcommittee that takes care of agriculture, rural development, and the FDA. Representative David Price of North Carolina is in charge of the subcommittee that funds our transportation, housing, and urban development projects. We have Representative Lucille Roybal-Allard of California. I've never even heard of this bitch, but she is the one who is determining the funding for the Department of Homeland Security. She's the chair of that committee, and she voted yes on the Patriot Act. And this one breaks my heart. The chair of the House Appropriations Committee is Representative Rosa DeLauro of Connecticut. She's a strange duck. You might know her from her outfits. She's Kristen Sinema level weird, but she's like a cool hippie lady. Like I've seen her sometimes with different colored hair. She is someone who has given some fiery speeches that I have liked, fighting for our rights and for our privacy. I am genuinely shocked that she voted for the Patriot Act. But when she got this committee assignment, when I saw that Rosa DeLauro got appropriations, I was like, what don't I know about her? Because there was no way that she seemed as, hippy dippy as it seemed, and yet could be in such good graces with Nancy Pelosi that she gets in charge of the House Appropriations Committee. And now that I learn a little bit more about her, she's a Patriot Act voter? Ew. But yeah, she's in charge of the House Appropriations Committee. I guess that's what it requires, is to have been in support of horrible laws for 20 years to get ahead in this Congress. Because who also got ahead? Representative Steny Hoyer of Maryland. He's the House Majority Leader right now, which means he's number 2 in the House of Representatives. Number 2 only to number 1, Nancy Pelosi of California, the Speaker of the House, who, yes, voted yes on the Patriot Act. When you add it all up, that's 67 members of our current Congress that voted yes on the Patriot Act 20 years ago. That's 12.5% of our current Congress who voted yes on the Patriot Act, not including Joe Biden, who has failed up to be president of the United States. But that does include all the most important people in Congress: Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, Chuck Schumer, Mitch McConnell. These are the current leaders of the House and the Senate. And they were there 20 years ago voting for the Patriot Act. Why does it feel like for my entire adult life, nothing has changed in Congress? It feels like the Bush years have never ended in Congress. This is fucking why. They haven't. 12.5% of this Congress are the people that voted for the Patriot Act. And what's even crazier is that, so I told you that those 2 provisions that have to do with spying on us, they expired in March of 2020, right? So after they expired, Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon got confirmation from the CIA that they believe that they had the authority and have been using it to collect information about the web browsing history of American targets of their spying. Now, to deal with that, the Speaker of the House, Patriot Act voter Nancy Pelosi, tasked the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Representative Adam Schiff, and Representative Zoe Lofgren to write a bill to stop the government from collecting and snooping on our web browsing histories. Now, let's take a beat and remember that Adam Schiff is one of the people who has written a bill that really freaks me out that basically makes it easy to designate Americans as domestic terrorists and use these Patriot Act provisions against us. I was really afraid of his bill more than anybody else's. And Representative Zoe Lofgren is the one who was wrong about what was in the Patriot Act 20 years ago. Her contribution to the debate was to bullshit on the floor. Now, do I know for sure that she knew that she was wrong? No, I don't know what she thought. But the point is, she was wrong. She was wrong. And yet, these are the three people, Nancy Pelosi, Adam Schiff, and Zoe Lofgren, 20 years later, are being trusted by us to fix the problems that the Patriot Act caused. No wonder it feels like nothing is getting solved. Oh, and by the way, that effort fell apart when Adam Schiff insisted on putting language in that bill that allows the government to essentially snoop on Americans' web browsing histories, as long as the government says that they didn't mean to. Like, oh, we were spying on this foreign guy and got this American's web search history by mistake, winky wink, and then it would be all good. And so that blew the whole thing up and they remain expired. But again, like I told you before, they're still spying on us. They're just using other authorities. But this is my point. We have people that have been in this Congress for 20 years who voted for a bill that is pretty much universally hated by pretty much all Americans. And yet 12.5% of this Congress have not been fired. They're the same individuals. In fact, they've almost all been promoted. And so big picture, what do we have to do? We have to get new people in Congress. And how about we just target these 12.5 to start with? Because that is why it feels like nothing is changing and it's been 20 years. That's why it feels like these laws are not getting better. If anything, they're getting worse. The process is getting worse. 20 years ago, we know that the Patriot Act skipped the whole committee process. They didn't do a conference committee. They put the text out on the floor. People didn't have time to read it. It's the same 20 years later because it's the same people in charge. So yeah, that's what I discovered. That's the thing that I'm the most fired up about after looking into the history of the Patriot Act. That the reason it feels like we're still in 2001 is because in a lot of ways, we are. And now real quick, just before I wrap this up, it won't take long, but I would like to thank the producers of Congressional Dish. This is a listener-supported podcast, and I definitely would not still be doing this if it weren't for you. I'm very burned out on paying attention to Congress. It is just depressing all the time, but you guys keep me going. So thank you for supporting the show. And unfortunately, I don't have any producer notes to read for you today because we don't have any executive producers to thank. So yeah, if you're someone who would like to be an executive producer and have your feedback read at the end of a main episode and have your name listed as an executive producer on any episode that you're especially proud to have contributed to, the cost is $1 per member of Congress. So it's $535. And you can do that in a lump sum or you can do that cumulatively. Most people have done it cumulatively. But yeah. I have nothing left to say because we have no executive producers. But to all the other producers, send in your notes along with your donations. I'm going to do a bonus thank you episode at the beginning of November. Please support the show. This little tiny show, it still exists, but we could really use your support because there's things I want to do and I can't afford to do them. So yeah, thank you for supporting the show. I'll be back in November with more congressional dysfunction for you. Until then, go and focus on something happy. Have a good Halloween. Get fat on candy. Enjoy yourselves. And I'll be back to talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, in the end he'll justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. We are
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.